Hey guys, in honor of the holidays, I thought I would do a simple winter landscape for beginners. And this is a nice exercise because it involves a little bit of planning in advance that goes a long way with supplies which are pretty affordable and on hand. So to start with, I'm using my anilinky watercolors. This set is a bit messed up, but basically I'm using these two, ultramarine blue and phthalo blue. Any ultramarine blue will work. I like using the anilinky watercolors for this because they're dye-based. And I have white gouache. If you don't have white gouache, that's fine. House paint, white acrylic, even tipex or whiteout fluid should work for this. Oil paint is really the only type of paint that won't work for this. So any sort of white opaque paint will work for the purposes of this exercise. And then I've got a candle and I've also got a coin that I've wrapped in a paper towel. I also have a pencil. So we're going to start by sketching out our winter landscape. So on the bottom fourth of the page, I'm going to just mark out a couple of hills. And this part is optional. So, if you've just started watercolor painting, you can avoid this and just skip this part. But if you want a little house in your landscape, I'm going to start by doing 2 horizontal lines. I'm going to connect those horizontal lines to make a rectangle. And then I'll have another line that's just almost imperceptibly angling upward. So just a slight angle upward, and then the line right beneath it, completely parallel. I'll close that off and then make a little triangle roof by putting an angle moving to the side. Another side, so a little triangle on top of the house. And then another line, this line is completely parallel to this line, so these 2 lines are completely parallel. Closing them off and also putting in a little roof. And then the very first thing I'll do is use a bit of yellow paint. So yellow watercolor works well for this. And just paint in the lower part of the house. Now I'm going to wash my brush completely and with clear water, wet down the full page. And actually, I just skipped a step. What you want to do here is rub your candle on its side over the full page. And you want to keep the pressure fairly consistent. So you're going over the whole page. I'm skipping this part because it's already wet, but just go over the entire page with the candle on its side using even pressure. If you press down too hard in some areas, you'll get a big sort of white block. And then I'm going to wet down the page with clear water. My water has a little bit of a tint to it. Don't worry about that. Just wetting down the page. And the one area that I'm going to avoid wetting down is just the house. So all right, so now I'm going to start with the ultramarine blue, which is the last one on your palette. And I'm going to use a graduated wash coming down through the sky. So if you haven't done this, you can watch Intro to Watercolor Effects. I'm going to actually mix in a tiny bit of red with this ultramarine to dull it down. if you're using sort of conventional watercolors, using a little bit of cadmium red will help here. And that's just to make it a little bit more natural of a color. So a little bit duller, a little bit less, less vibrant. It's up to you what sort of color you want. And I'm just coming all the way down the sky. And while I do this, and while the paint's still wet, I'm going to quickly come in and mark out the moon. So just lifting it out, putting a coin down on the page. As I move down the page, I'm going to start adding in more of the phthalo blue, which is the color right next to the ultramarine. Don't worry about getting this perfect, or if you only have ultramarine, it's fine too. Just bring the ultramarine all the way down to the bottom of the page. And you'll see that the candle is basically repelling the paint so that we get that nice snow effect. Okay, and I'm going to let that sit for a minute. We need to let this dry. You can use a hairdryer, just careful that you let the paint sit for a moment so it sort of absorbs into the page and doesn't go flying everywhere. So I'm just going to use a hairdryer. Got one here. All right. And now if you've lost sight of your hill line, you can redraw that in at this point. Otherwise, I'm going to use kind of a rough brush I have on hand. This is a nylon brush that has just been overused, so it's sort of like breaking across at the end. If you have a hog's bristle brush, that will work fine as well. And I'm going to mix together some of this dark green and purple to create a really dark color. And I'll add a little bit of red in there just to make it a bit more nuanced. If you don't have any of these colors, that's fine. You can just use black, really, or green and any mix of dark blue. The key is to get it to the right darkness. That's more important than getting it green. And I'm going to just start by painting down. Base of the tree line. And then I'm going to use the brush on its side vertically and just tap some little lines coming up. So these are going to be the tops of the trees. And then I'm going to use the brush horizontally, tapping on its side, to flesh out the branches. So I'm just tapping the brush on the side. The main thing that you want here is the top of the branches. So if you're sort of struggling to do this tapping effect on the side of the branch, what you can do is simply do the very tops of the trees and paint in the lower part of the branch. It's not going to make all that much difference. I like the textured effect, and I think this is a really good effect with watercolor, so I'm just going to tap the brush on its side to create this texture coming across and a little bit more nuance. Mix up a little bit more paint. It's always a challenge knowing in advance how much paint you really need for something. And adding the purple to the green, essentially greens in nature have a bit of red in them. So you almost always are going to want to add a little bit of red to your green watercolors when you're painting from life. The only place that's going to be super bright green is if something is straight in the light, and here we've got all these trees and a dark sky, so they're all going to be very dark. And this part is optional too, but just to get a little bit more immediacy, I'm also going to do a tree more in the foreground. So I'll start just by doing the side of the tree coming down here, and then tapping my brush to the side to create some rows of branches in the foreground. And I want this tree to be super, super dark. And I'm gonna just use that purple to paint the bottom of the house. So actually, while I'm here, if you've decided to do the house, one thing I'll do is I'm gonna extend this yellow up into kind of the upper part of the house. And then I'm gonna get some of that phthalo blue, just add a little bit of water to it, and paint in the top of the roof. And while I leave this to dry a bit, I'm going to start with the white gouache. So I'll start by just creating some snow. And if you've done this little house, you might want to do a little path. I'm just using some of phthalo blue and going like this beforehand. Entirely up to you whether you do the house or the path. And then I'm gonna bring the bring the white gouache over the snow. And you can get a lot of variation in the snow just by where you place the most white gouache. It's entirely up to you, where you place the highlights. The highlights will be wherever the tops of your hills are, and it'll be a little bit darker in the back, but it's not going to make that big of a difference. Okay, and you'll notice with the white gouache that in between layers, if you let one layer dry, it's easier to place a second layer on with more opacity after that. So if you just allow the white gouache to dry, if you want to make it lighter, just wait for it to dry and then do another layer. And for the house, I've got some brown and blue gouache, but you can also just use some purple and brown gouache from your anilinky watercolors. And I'm just going to use a fine brush, and I'm going to box out a little front door. Where the light's coming from. And just going to color in this part of the house. The easiest way is just do one horizontal mark, then one mark straight down the middle, then one mark straight down the side, and then either side, and then just gradually make these windows smaller. So often it's easier to think of the negative space, so that's all the space that isn't the subject, in this case all the space outside of the windows, than it is to try to paint the windows in themselves. So we're just making smaller and smaller vertical and horizontal lines in order to get those windows. And I'm gonna make the chimney just a little bit dark. And then if your trees are dry, it's time to put in the snow. Now here is where your brush marks do start to matter. So you'll want to use either a really worn down brush or a bristle brush. This brush has really frayed edges, so it's sort of broken apart. You can kind of see there, which makes it really useful. And this is a dry brush stippling technique. So basically what I'm going to do is, with a completely dry brush, dip it into the white gouache without really any water added to the white gouache, and then very lightly tap it across the page. You might want to practice a spare sheet of paper with a spare sheet of paper with this. Most of the problems you'll encounter here are based on just pressing down too hard. So if you find that your paint is just blobbing up, it's because you're pressing down a bit too hard. But I'm just going to lightly tap the white gouache in horizontally over the trees. So I'm just tapping my brush on its side, and that's creating the effect of very snow-laden trees. Now the tree closer to me, I'm gonna you're sort of angling the snow to hit the base of where the branches would be. And I can tell I'm gonna need a few layers for this tree because the paint is coming through. While I wait for this tree to dry, because I want to layer it up, I'm going to come in and paint the roof of my little house with a thick layer of the white gouache paint. I'm also going to paint a little bit of white gouache across the other side of the house, and careful you don't get too much water on your brush here. And if you want, just to kind of show the whole range of effects in gouache, you can dilute some of the gouache and actually come in from the chimney with a curving bit of smoke. And it's going to seem like it's translucent as it goes over the trees. So this is thinned down, and the base of this layer of smoke is going to be narrower, whereas the top is going to get whiter and more dilute. You can also use the white gouache if you want to, if your moon's a little bit too dark to move on the moon. But I kind of like the moon kind of covered by the snow effect, so I'm going to just leave it there. But you could add clouds to the sky, anything like that. I'm just going to use the hairdryer one more time, and that's because I want to brighten up the snow on the tree closest to me. And I'm going to do another layer of snow on the branches of this tree here. And you'll see that the paint's a lot more opaque, so it's a lot more visible now that the page is drier. So you can just layer up the gouache by waiting for each layer to dry. And I'm just going to make the tops of the hills a little bit lighter. Particularly the hills closest to where I am. And I like the way that the blue sort of comes from underneath the gouache to create the effect of volume in the snow. All right. And if you feel like adding more and you have a pen on hand, I don't, so I'm using a pencil, you can even sort of refine these windows, put in little, window, whatever those are called, window bars, or just leave it like this. And I'm just going to reinforce the smoke coming up a bit because I've sort of lost that, so I'm just going to one more layer of smoke. Okay, and there you have it, your beginner's winter landscape. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you did this exercise, if you could tag at Soho_life_drawing on Instagram, that's where we see all of the work that you've made. And thank you for watching. Okay.